thanks everyone for joining. I see over 130 attendees loading here. So why don't we kick this off? My name is John Murphy. I am BIOS Deputy General Counsel and Vice President for Healthcare. And we appreciate the time everybody has taken today to sit down or virtually sit down and have a webinar with us. This is sort of a unique webinar for Bio because oftentimes we do these related to specific advocacy issues or other sort of healthcare policy issues. And we're taking a step back today to talk more about an issue that is important for our biotech companies as employers. And that is our questions that have arisen in many of the bio work groups about the availability of vaccination campaigns for our employees, how we deal with that from an HR perspective, and how we assess our return to work, hopefully, over the next 6 to 9 months as we sort of roll out. We're sort of in a really unique environment here. 11 months ago, I hosted a webinar with the general membership where we talked about state-by-state lockdown mandates and the ability to get biotech lab personnel designated as essential for purposes of getting biotech research and development ongoing so that we could develop medicines to get ourselves out of this pandemic. Now, fast forward here, and we're coming up on a 1-year anniversary of many people's initial going out of office, lockdown, and we have 2 approved vaccines here in the United States, potentially a 3rd vaccine getting approved or authorized by the FDA fairly soon. We had data come out of Russia this morning that shows that their vaccine seems to be fairly effective for the people that have been dosed over there. We have an authorized vaccine in Europe from AstraZeneca and potentially more from Novavax as their trial continues to read out. So we have lots and lots of options coming slowly, but surely, and actually at a really fast pace for biotech research and development. And that's a real highlight, I think, for the industry as we move forward. But, we're seeing some of this stuff start to make an impact. There was an article in the New York Times this morning that showed an overview of the Israeli situation where they have been far ahead of many other countries in getting vaccinations, and deaths, hospitalizations, and even severe illness in the over 60 age population are materially decreasing. And we also have, hints of this vaccination campaign leading to better advancements in all vaccinations. There was a Pfizer earnings call today where they discussed the applicability of its mRNA vaccination platform for the flu, potentially over the next couple of years. I think, for many of us, this time is going to accelerate very much some of the research and development efforts that the industry is going to put forward. And I think we will look back on this as both a challenging time, but also a very valuable time for the industry to show what it can really do for patients here in the United States and across the world. But we can't ignore the fact that there are a lot of challenges facing both we as employers and we as an industry. There are 300 state bills right now currently in circulation that are looking to in some way affect the ability of employers to mandate vaccines, affect the ability of individuals to say no to vaccinations. There are, since I looked at a statistic this morning, that since March 2020, there have been 4.5 billion views on the internet of anti-vaccine information. And so we have a big challenge, both as employers, but as an industry, to get the word out about the importance of these breakthroughs and the ability of it to help return us to some semblance of normal over the next 12 months. And I encourage all of you on the phone here, not just to listen to the content we have here, but check out websites like the Stronger campaign that Bio is involved with, which is out there to try and help fight misinformation on vaccinations and really sort of doing a service to the public to help drive the scientific discussion as opposed to the internet-fueled conspiracy theory discussion. So what we're going to talk about today really is that relevant discussion for you as employers and as employees of an organization that want to get back in the saddle in person and think about the vaccination campaigns you might be able to stand up either as an employer, as a life science company, or as a cluster. And so we have experts from our member firm, Hogan Lovells. Melissa Bianchi, George Ingham, and David Horowitz are going to kick us off here and go through some of the practical and the legal issues associated both with mandatory vaccination campaigns, some considerations about returning to in-person work, taking the foot off the gas pedal on some other COVID issues some of us have implemented in the office. And after we go through that presentation, we have Lori Keating from Alnylam Pharmaceuticals and Darren Lippold from Neurocrine Biosciences, two of our very involved general counsels, who I thought we thought it would be useful for them to sort of give us that practical discussion of how they, as leaders in their companies, are thinking about implementing potentially some of these policies that the Hogan team have gone over, what they're hearing from their employers, what they're hearing from their state health departments, and how they're sort of categorizing the discussions internally as the management teams assess going back into the office. And then we'll kind of wrap this up. You will all see that there is a chat function and the ability to ask a question. And if you want to type those in while we go, I'm going to keep an eye on that, and I will use my moderator's prerogative to send those questions to the team and get some answers for you. Just for a couple of housekeeping questions, I know folks have asked whether or not this will be recorded. We are recording the webinar, so you will be able to access this for colleagues of yours who haven't been able to join live. We will have contact information for our panelists, for all of you who want to hire great legal services after this to help affect these policies. You can reach out directly. So without further ado, why don't we bring up the slides, and I'm going to kick it over to Melissa, George, and David to start the material part of this discussion.
Thank you very much, John, and it's really a privilege to be able to talk with you all today about this very important issue. So we're here today, as John said, we're going to be talking about a number of issues relating to COVID-19 vaccines and how they apply to you as employers, and what are the types of issues that we're seeing employers thinking about and that we think are important. Now, on its surface, there's a lot of simple issues relating to vaccines, but as you dig in from an employment law standpoint, there's a number of complexities. And really, if we wanted, we could talk about these issues for hours and hours and hours. And I have been doing that with a lot of different clients. But because we have a relatively short period to cover this material, we're going to try to cover a number of different topics and hopefully focus you on the key issues that we're seeing. And that should give you a good jumping off point to focus on these issues moving forward. Could we go to the next slide, please? So the way that we've framed this presentation is really the top 10 questions that employers should be considering about vaccines. And so the first question here is, well, this is the one that everybody really has been talking about at the beginning, and we couldn't give this presentation without talking about it. So the first question, can an employer make a COVID-19 vaccine mandatory? Next slide, please. The answer to that question is most likely yes. And let me explain why I say most likely yes. It says yes on the slide, and as a practical matter, that is the answer, but let's just talk this through. So the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which enforces, among other things, the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is a federal law protecting against disability, as well as Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, which protects, among other things, religion. The EEOC says that it is appropriate to have a mandatory vaccination policy so long as you provide accommodations for vaccination on the basis of disability and religion. Now, to be clear, the EEOC's guidance is just that. It is guidance. It isn't law. It isn't a statute. It isn't a regulation. It's guidance. That said, it's going to have a lot of weight when people are considering, what the correct interpretation of the ADA is. But it's important to know that, this is something where the EEOC could change its mind, where a private plaintiff could file a lawsuit disagreeing with the EEOC's interpretation. Also, John brought up a really great point in his introduction. employers need to watch for state and local law that could be an issue regarding mandatory vaccination policies. This is an issue that is still developing right now. As John mentioned, there are something like 300 state bills that are out there, and there have been proposals sort of all over about what the law may be in a state or locality. But this is just something to keep in mind. But as we stand today, I would say it's a pretty low risk for an employer to impose a mandatory vaccination program. But that said, the harder question is not whether you can, but really whether you should impose such a program. And the answer to that depends a lot on the nature of your workplace, depends on some culture issues, and depends on really the cost-benefit analysis. So let me go through what I consider some key considerations in thinking through whether you should impose such a program. There could be other considerations, but these are the ones that I'm seeing employers be most focused on. So the first, of course, is availability. Presently, vaccines are not universally available. They are becoming more and more available to employers in particular. Those of you who are on the call today are potentially getting access to these more so than all employers. But the key point here is that until the vaccine is readily available to the people you're going to mandate it for, you can't have a mandatory policy. So that's the first consideration. Second consideration is that if you have a mandatory program, and this is a really important point that we're going to turn to later, but one that kind of flies under the radar, is that if you want to administer a vaccine to your employees or contract with a third party who's going to make them available to your employees or who will vaccinate your employees, you actually have to meet a heightened legal standard to do that if you have a mandatory program versus a voluntary program. Again, we're going to cover this in more detail in a later slide, but I think that's a really important point because I know a lot of employers in the biotech area are thinking about bringing the vaccine to their employees. So if that's a priority, this is an important thing to think about. The third point, and we'll cover this in more detail, is that there's the issue of accommodations. If someone has a disability or has a sincerely held religious belief, they may be entitled to an accommodation from a mandatory program. Fourth issue, if you happen to have any unionized employees, there could be bargaining obligations. Fifth issue, as we talked about, state or local law. Sixth issue is that there could be wage and hour laws that impose different consequences for a mandatory program. So if you have non-exempt hourly workers, you're likely going to need to pay them for the time it takes them to get the vaccine if it's mandatory, but not if it's voluntary. The seventh issue is the issue about side effects. If you have a mandatory program, those potentially could be a more significant issue if you happen to have an employee that has one of these unusual side effects. Again, it's not a common thing, but it's something to think about as you're weighing the costs and benefits. So at the end of the day, you really need to think about what works for your workforce. But one really important point is, when do you make the decision? When do you decide whether you're going to have a mandatory program or a voluntary program? And one thing that I've been talking with a lot of employers about is that they're really focused on the fact that maybe we don't want to right now come out and say we're going to have a mandatory program. Maybe we want to wait and see what the supplies are, see what other employers are doing, see how many of their employees voluntarily go out and get the vaccine, or respond to encouragement from the employer. So that's one thing that I think is important. Next slide, please. So the second question, and this is one of the things I flagged earlier, what do you do when you have a mandatory program and employees object to the program? Next slide, please. So there are a few considerations in handling employee objections, and as John correctly mentioned at the introduction to the presentation, right now there is a lot of chatter on the internet that people are raising basically theories that really aren't supported by facts about vaccines being something that people shouldn't get. And I think we all saw the news about the protests in Los Angeles recently. So I think the bottom line there is that employers, whether these are meritorious objections or not, employers should expect that there are going to be employees who do, potentially raise objections. So how do you handle these types of issues? The EEOC makes clear that under the Americans with Disabilities Act and Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, you may be required to provide exemptions to a mandatory vaccination policy if an employee has a disability or a sincerely held religious belief that prevents the employee from receiving the vaccine. And as I'm about to talk about, pregnancy can play into that as well. But one really important thing here is someone that simply, if you look at the last bullet point, I just don't like vaccines. I think that, that they're dangerous, and, that's not going to be a valid basis to refuse a mandatory vaccine program. On the other hand, if someone has a medical or religious reason, they may be entitled to an exemption. So let's talk about that a little bit. Starting with the issue of disability, since there were some amendments to the Americans with Disabilities Act in 2009, which is the federal law that governs disability accommodations. Since those amendments, a disability has been defined very broadly. And generally speaking, contesting an employee's claim that the employee has a medical impairment that doesn't rise to the level of a disability is usually a losing battle for an employer. So whether an employee has a disability precluding vaccination oftentimes is going to be driven in large part by what the employee's doctor says. And additionally, a disability could include things like allergies to the components of the vaccine. It could even be anxiety about receiving the vaccine, or an employee may seek an accommodation on the basis of a medical condition relating to pregnancy. Likewise, a sincerely held religious belief can be defined in a fairly broad manner, including beliefs that are non-theistic, but they're held with the strength of a religious belief. So when an employer receives requests of this nature that are based on disability or based on religion, the employer has to consider, first, whether it is a sincerely held religious belief or a disability, and then if so, whether the employee can be accommodated from the vaccine requirement, and can only exclude the employee from the workplace in narrow circumstances if the employee has a disability that really lines up with not getting vaccinated. So what the EEOC says, for example, with respect to a disability accommodation, is that an employee can only be excluded if an unvaccinated employee would pose, quote, a significant risk of substantial harm to the employee or others in the workplace. So one issue that comes up here, and this is one that, when you're sort of talking about employers that really know their stuff about vaccines, which is a lot of you, what happens if you're an employer and an employee requests, say, a disability accommodation that, medically the employer just knows, like, that isn't right, the doctor's wrong, or the doctor doesn't have the expertise to opine on that issue. How do you deal with something like that? I think there's a practical answer to that, and then there's a legal answer. From a legal perspective, the ADA does give the employer the right to ask additional questions from the healthcare professional. If the healthcare professional is not, someone that has the proper expertise to opine on the issue, the employer could ask that the employee go to a different doctor. After trying to get the employee to give sufficient documentation, the employer can sometimes request that the employee be examined by a doctor of the employer's choice. But the practical issue there is that's really expensive and burdensome to do. The other thing is, if you anticipate having a number of accommodation requests and you don't treat all employees equally, you could get discrimination claims. So you really want to think about how hard line we want to be if we're not going to, take employees' doctors' notes kind of at face value. Another point here, what if you get a group of employees who come to you and they complain at the same time about a vaccine policy? We would call that concerted protected activity. That doesn't mean you don't have to apply the policy the way that you intend to apply it, but you just want to make sure that when people are coming forward and complaining, that you don't treat them differently, because that could pose the risk of a retaliation claim. The other point that I would make is if you implement a mandatory policy, it's really important to have a process in place. You should really consider having a specific person, preferably someone in HR, who serves as a point of contact on all exemption requests. Managers should be trained to refer all exemption requests to that person, and managers should not be trying to handle exemption requests on their own. So I'm going to pass the presentation to David, who's going to cover another issue, and please go to the next slide.
So the question comes up, is the fact that the vaccine has been authorized under an EUA relevant to whether an employer can require an employee to receive it? Please go to the next slide. So by statute, FDA has the authority to establish conditions under an emergency use authorization to ensure that the recipients of the vaccine are informed of the option to accept or to refuse it, and the consequences, if any, for refusing administration. FDA's guidance on EUAs has interpreted this as a requirement for FDA. And so for the 2 COVID-19 vaccines approved so far, FDA has authorized, as part of the EUAs, fact sheets for healthcare providers and patients that implement this authority. So the healthcare provider fact sheet says that the vaccination provider must communicate that the recipient has the option to accept or refuse the vaccine, and the corresponding patient fact sheet says it's your choice to receive or not receive the vaccine. Now, we believe that informing patients of the right to refuse the vaccine does not by itself prohibit an employer from imposing consequences for that refusal. So the statute recognizes that there may be such consequences, and the statutory provision, we believe, was meant to inform patients that it's up to them to decide whether to take the vaccine or accept the consequences of not taking it. And this is consistent with the well-established concept of informed consent. Last, I wanted to note that communications should not refer to the EUA authorized vaccines as approved by FDA, because FDA reserves that term for vaccines that are licensed with a BLA that FDA has approved, and it could be perceived as misleading to characterize an EUA authorized vaccine as approved. Next slide.
All right, I think this is me. So question 4, what questions can an employer ask employees about vaccines? Next slide, please. So the key rule in thinking about what kind of questions can employers ask about vaccines, and this could be in the context of a mandatory program or a non-mandatory program, is that they need to be for a legitimate business purpose. So don't ask questions that you don't intend to use for a particular purpose. The question should not be about protected class or health or genetic information, and the information learned from the question should be maintained confidentially and separately from medical files. And Melissa's going to talk about that and sort of the privacy aspect here on the next slide. This slide here describes some questions that we would consider okay, a question that we'd consider as questionable, and some questions we think that are risky. So for example, we think that it's fine for an employer to ask, whether an employee's been vaccinated, or to ask the employee for proof of the vaccination. The EEOC actually says that's fine. But on the other hand, if you're asking questions about say, why did an employee not get vaccinated, or why did an employee not want to get vaccinated? Those questions are risky because they're likely to reveal confidential medical information. Also, asking questions about an employee's family members, that tends to reveal information that's covered by the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. So those are not recommended questions. So I'm going to pass it to Melissa now to cover some more details about privacy-related issues.
Great, thanks. I think we can go to the next slide. And so we're going to talk just briefly about how you track the data and what some of the privacy issues to consider. So let's go on to the next slide. So as George said, we have GINA, the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, and we also have HIPAA and state information, health information privacy laws that may apply. And so a couple things, as George mentioned, when you're asking about vaccination status, don't ask about family members. Don't ask if they've been vaccinated, or otherwise ask about their health. When you're collecting proof, or if you're collecting proof of vaccination, don't seek or provide a form, or basically take steps to avoid collecting any extra medical information. If you just want to know if someone got the vaccine or not, let's just try to collect that. HIPAA generally is not going to apply to the employee information that you have, but there are places that HIPAA could apply. And so just navigating that carefully will be important. If you do get proof of vaccination from a plan, a health plan or a healthcare provider, then we may be in a HIPAA space. And for example, if you have the employee health information that's held by you in your capacity as an employer is not protected health information under HIPAA, but any of the information that's collected directly from a health plan, from your employee health plan, or from a doctor or pharmacy, hospital, when in the hands of those entities, it is covered by HIPAA. And so if you're going to get information directly from those entities, you're probably going to need an employee consent and authorization to allow the disclosure to you as the employer. There are cases where there may be an exception under HIPAA where the information is necessary for the employer's workplace safety monitoring requirements. That'll, I think, evolve over the next few months, perhaps, and where the information is created at the request of the employer. And so we may have an exception in some cases where instead of that consent form, you may be able to provide employees with a notice that the information will be shared with you as the employer. It's made easier if you just request proof of vaccination from the employees directly, rather than through a HIPAA regulated entity, because it just makes it more straightforward, although the state privacy laws may still apply. A couple other points. Be careful in providing management information about who is vaccinated. This is really information that should stay with HR. And I know there can be very good intentions. I've had a lot of questions actually from employers who, had senior management want to send cards to people who had COVID, or well-intentioned, but best to avoid, right? We don't need management to know who has what or any health information about employees. And so keep it as an HR function. You can aggregate and anonymize the data to protect employee privacy and to provide general numbers perhaps to management, but just have a clear business purpose for what you're going to do with the information, and just don't provide it on a level that would identify those who didn't get vaccinated. And again, that might provide information about individuals who had a disability, for example. Also, as George mentioned, let's keep the information secure. It is sensitive information, and keep it separate from personnel files, and restrict information, restrict access to those individuals who really need to know. So, and predominantly that's going to be HR. I think we can go to the next one.
All right, so this is me, and this is a question about what if you want to set up an on-site vaccination clinic for your employees, or you want to make a particular vendor available to employees to get vaccinated, to encourage them to get it, or make it easier for them, or to build employee morale, or for some other purpose. Next slide, please. Yep. Interestingly enough, it is more challenging from a legal perspective to have an on-site clinic if vaccines are mandatory rather than if they're voluntary. And we've sort of been hearing that companies in this space, in the biotech space, as well as other employers that are larger and very focused on the benefits of vaccines, have really been thinking about how can we make it easier for our employees to get vaccinated. So I think this is an important issue. So if vaccines are mandatory, here's sort of the legal analysis. If they're mandatory, then due to screening questions that have to be asked in order to administer the vaccine, the employer can only ask those questions, which we call disability-related inquiries, and therefore only have an on-site vaccination clinic by meeting a heightened legal standard. And that's even if the vendor is asking the questions. It's sort of considered to be the employer asking them. And so according to the EEOC, to meet that heightened standard, the employer, when asking the questions of a particular employee, would need to have a reasonable belief based on objective evidence that an employee who does not answer the questions and therefore does not receive a vaccination will pose a direct threat to the health or safety of her or himself or others. And that standard is a mouthful, but the bottom line is, whether employees are going to meet this standard is going to differ employee by employee. I would say that employees working in an office setting are unlikely to meet that standard. Employees in other settings might. Also, the issue, if questions are being asked and screening questions, the employer also has to be careful that none of those are going to include genetic related information as well, including family medical history. But sort of the bottom line is, if you have a mandatory vaccination program and you want to have an on-site clinic, you really have to think about which employees can we ask this of, and maybe if we really want to have that on-site clinic, a voluntary program makes sense. So if you have a voluntary program, the heightened legal standard I just talked about does not apply. Next slide, please. There's a couple of considerations, if you are thinking about, having an on-site clinic that we would flag. One is just sort of the basic, and ensuring that the vaccination program and process is safe, that there's trained personnel doing it, that there's social distancing. You don't want to have a super spreader event at your vaccination clinic, that you're in compliance with requirements for vaccine administration. You also want to make sure there's privacy during the screening and vaccination process. You don't want to have employees answering screening questions in front of their coworkers. You also want to think about, if you're entering into a contract, what are the terms of the contract with the vaccination provider? You should also consider thinking about staggering vaccination schedules over multiple days for a number of reasons. First, it reduces the number of people congregating. Secondly, to the extent that employees have some mild side effects, that you're not going to have your whole workforce kind of feeling not so good on the same day. And then, another thing to think about is surveying the workforce. It would be permissible to send out a note to say, hey, who would be interested in an on-site clinic? You can see if you've got that kind of support, and if you do, might be a great thing to do. If most people say, we're not that interested, or we got vaccinated already, then maybe it's not worth it. So let me stop here. I want to pass it to Melissa briefly, just to touch on these privacy issues covered in two of the bullet points here.
Sure. So I will just add that if you do have an on-site clinic, that clinic may be subject to privacy laws itself, depending on how it's structured. And so note that the state privacy laws may apply. And to the extent that the clinic is billing a health plan for the vaccine and for the vaccine administration, then the clinic may be a covered healthcare provider under HIPAA. And to the extent that as an employer you were paying for it, there also may be other HIPAA considerations, including whether that needs to be a plan or how that's structured with respect to your employee health plan. So again, it's just a matter of thinking through the details and getting it set up at the outset. David, do you want to cover the PrEP Act?
Thanks, Melissa. Yeah, As some of you know, the PrEP Act is a federal law that provides immunity from liability during a public health emergency for the use of covered countermeasures like an EUA vaccine and for covered persons. So it's important to have some knowledge of PrEP Act coverage for an employer that is considering offering on-site vaccination clinics and similar offerings. So to get that coverage, covered persons under the PrEP Act include program planners, and those are people who supervise or administer a vaccine administration program, including employers like corporations. When they establish requirements or provide a facility to administer an EUA covered vaccine. It's also important to consider whether the person who is administering the vaccine in your on-site clinic is a covered person. Generally, that would include those authorized to vaccinate under state law, including licensed nurses and pharmacists with the appropriate training. But this is complicated because HHS has actually issued some advisory opinions in an effort to expand the pool of vaccinators who can be covered persons. Employers who implement a vaccination program will need to be sure that the vaccinators that they choose are covered persons who can obtain PrEP Act liability protection. Next slide.
Great. Thank you, David. So let's talk a little bit about the issue of different rules for different segments of the workplace. And this could be in the area of mandatory vaccine rules. This could be in the area of rules for any number of things. So let's just move to the next slide and cover this briefly. So let's say, for example, an employer wants to adopt a hybrid approach and to say that, look, our workers who are working in close quarters, they've got to be on site. They can't really be separated in the way that somebody working at a desk can. We want to make it a mandatory program for them. We want others to be encouraged. This is something that is, potentially permissible. You just want to think through the fact that you need to treat similarly situated workers the same. So you don't want to take a bunch of people that have the same job conditions and pick out 3 of them and say, you've got to get vaccinated, the others don't have to. That would potentially pose a risk of discrimination claims. On the other hand, if you're picking people based on, legitimate distinctions, then that's fine. So for example, asking your teleworkers to get mandatory vaccines, it makes sense not to ask teleworkers to do it, but to ask people that are working in close quarters all the time to potentially do that. Also thinking about the location of the job, the type of job, are they in a union? That could be a legitimate difference. And state and local laws could be another difference. Next slide, please. This slide asks, what can an employer require of non-employees? So what if you have independent contractors? What if you have visitors, people who are coming on site? What can you do with respect to those individuals? Next slide. So speaking at a very general level, there's more leeway to require non-employees to be vaccinated as a condition of coming on site. And that's because they're not protected by the typical suite of employment laws that we've been talking about. Now, that's not always the case, and you really have to check your state and local laws. There are some states, so just speaking about the issue of independent contractors, there's some states like New York that actually provide that independent contractors are entitled to disability and religious accommodations. So you got to be really thoughtful about your state and local laws, but as sort of a general matter, you have more leeway with non-employees than with employees. I have flagged an issue at the bottom here that's sort of an issue that, I know that a lot of you are based in California and Massachusetts. When you start, in California, I don't know that you can lawfully engage independent contractors in many settings anymore. But the more control you exercise over an independent contractor, the more likely you are to potentially have a misclassification finding. So that's just something to keep in mind about control over contractors. Next slide, please. Now, this is an issue that John had brought up originally at the beginning of the presentation, which I think is an important one, which is how, can vaccines get people back, get businesses back to normal, get people back to normal? What do we do about our business operations based on vaccine rates? Next slide, please. Now, the answer right now is kind of a downer, but you want to look at this in sort of the long haul, okay? So right now, based on the laws that are out there as they stand today, and based on some very hot off the presses guidance from OSHA, which I'll talk about, employers shouldn't make major changes to business operations based on vaccination rates. Now, check back, that could change. It could, right now, while I'm talking, we could see new laws enacted that change things, and that's happened to me in multiple COVID-19 webinars over the past year. But right now, no major changes should be made, because why is that? Well, state and local requirements still apply, and right now, OSHA is thinking about promulgating a nationwide safety standard, and right now, the laws that I've been tracking have not imposed carve-outs relating to vaccination requirements. So Virginia just promulgated a new COVID regulation, for example. It doesn't have carve-outs for vaccines. California recently published guidance stating that its COVID emergency temporary standard does not change its obligations based on vaccination. And OSHA recently published some guidance that I'll put up on the screen in the next slide, but essentially it said that employers should not be making distinctions to employees on the basis of vaccination status in terms of the safety requirements that they follow. Now, all of this said, you as an employer may be taking steps right now that go above and beyond whatever the legal standard is. Maybe you're exceeding the standard, you're testing your employees once a week, you're doing things that aren't required by law, but they go above and beyond. Could you relax some of those things? You could. I think that there's some level of risk there, because at this point, what we're getting out of OSHA is, hold on. So in some sense, you might be going a little against the grain there, but look, I think there's at least some discretion to do that. But I think that probably the most prudent course would be, at least for right now, might be best to wait and see where we are in a month, see what the trends are, and also whether there's some further legal developments. If we could go to the next slide, just very briefly. This is the new OSHA guidance, and I don't know if this presentation will be distributed. If it's not, please, I'm sure that there'll be a way to get access to this. But if you go to OSHA.gov, you can get a link to this guidance. But it discusses the issue of vaccines. I think it's worth taking a look at. And also, I will say, given that OSHA is right now thinking about implementing a nationwide standard, I think taking a look at this guidance is not a bad idea, because this guidance may become an actual standard that employers need to follow, or maybe the basis for a standard at some point in the future. We shall see. Next slide, please. So last question is, what are some ways that we have been seeing employers try to encourage employees to get vaccinated? Let's say that you don't have a mandatory program. What are some things that employers have been doing? And there's a lot of different things, but let's talk about some of the key ones. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we've seen a lot of employers do, and we think in an industry like this, it makes a lot of sense, is leading by example. Company leaders going and getting a vaccine and telling everybody about it. Saying that they did it and they hope everybody else will too. Incentives are another thing that we've been seeing, and some employers have gotten some good press about providing incentives to employees to get a vaccine. Considerations about incentives, you know, it's pretty low risk to provide incentives as long as you keep a few things in mind. So optimally, the incentive shouldn't be excessive. It should preferably be tied to, you know, what I would call the inconvenience associated with getting the vaccine. So for example, look, if it's going to take a couple hours to go get a vaccine, plus, you know, a little bit of extra time, plus, you know, hey, if you have some side effects, we'll give you a day off. Basically, that you're kind of looking at, hey, maybe we give people 4 hours of, you know, paid time off, plus, you know, if you need time off to recover, we'll give you that time too. That's sort of a plausible kind of low risk incentive. It's important that, you know, the incentives be a benefit, not avoidance of a penalty. So, you know, if getting a vaccine is necessary to get benefits that all other employees get who have been vaccinated, like, you know, getting, you know, additional shifts at work or being able to take advantage of work opportunities, that makes you move more toward, hey, this might not really be a voluntary program, this might be mandatory. So that's something to think about. But I think incentives are a useful tool. Also, you know, educating employees, you know, trying to make clear, you know, people or employers in this industry have particular authority to talk to their employees about the benefits of vaccines and about, you know, the science and about the facts. And I think, you know, giving your employees educational resources and giving them the opportunity, you know, you don't want to force people to take in information, but to make it available to them, I think can be really helpful. And I think employees can see that as a benefit. Also, the CDC has published some resources that may be useful. They've got, you know, this, what they call an essential worker vaccine toolkit, has some materials that can be, you know, provided to employees and it may be useful as tips. So that concludes our session of the presentation. I know that that we have some more comments from Lori and Darren, and I guess I'll turn it back to John to pass it over to them.
Yeah, thanks to the Hogan team for this great presentation, and to answer George's sort of embedded question in there, we can make the slides available outside of the recorded webinar for those of you who maybe don't want to listen to this whole thing again, but want to take a look at the slides. So we'll make that available after this. You know, I think what's interesting about this is about a month ago, some of this stuff seemed so far off because supply was so aggressively constrained. And it's not to say that it is, you know, completely available now, but we're starting to see signs of increased availability where I think we as employers are going to start actually facing some of this in the somewhat near term. You know, you saw the data this morning from the CDC that we're quickly approaching 40 million vaccinations in the United States. You know, if you believe Dr. Scott Gottlieb, once we hit about 100 million, 110 million vaccinations, we're going to see demands kind of wane, unfortunately, if we use flu as any sort of a corollary to demand in the United States. And then, you know, the White House announced this morning they're going to start directly shipping upwards of 1 million to 2 million doses directly to CVS and Walgreens starting next week, and in addition to an increased allocation to the states. So, you know, I think we're starting to hit a point where we're seeing this ramp up. And if we bring that third vaccine online over the next 30 days, we could actually see a situation where our employees are able to go to a local pharmacy or to a local vaccination clinic. And these questions become much more material for an employer. So we have Lori Keating and Darren Lippold here, who I've spoken to both of them, and both of them have really interesting perspectives on what they're thinking about from their companies and how they're going to roll these sorts of issues out to their broader workforce. And we hear a lot from our very small emerging companies as they struggle with how to benchmark or what to do. They look to some of our more established companies just to sort of gauge how these things are being handled. Obviously, culture matters for every company, but I think from a precedent-setting standpoint, it's really interesting. So maybe I'll turn to Lori first. Lori, do you want to give us some of the perspectives we talked about for Alnylam, or at least for as you think about this?
Sure, happy to, and thank you so much to the Hogan panelists. It was really a great outline of the top 10 considerations, and I think it really gives us a wonderful framework. And as John said, this is really timely, since for many employers, depending on what state you're located in or how many states you're located in, the March, April timeframe might really improve the availability issue. So for Massachusetts, where we're located, we have about 1,000 people in the United States, but across the country. But the bulk of our employees and our 2 manufacturing sites are in Massachusetts. And unfortunately, the great Commonwealth has not done a good job of distributing and administering vaccinations. And you've probably seen press that West Virginia and Arkansas and Mississippi are well ahead of the brain trust in Massachusetts. With the great advocacy from MassBio, there's some more clarification of where our essential workers do fall. Initially, it looked like we were in phase 3, which meant when the general public got the vaccine, we would get the vaccine. Even though we're manufacturing and distributing medicines for life-threatening diseases and have in the clinic really important programs. So that was really dismaying. We now have clarity that we're included as part of what's called medical supply the medical supply chain workers. That's a category within the 3rd group in the current phase that just started yesterday. I got to participate in a phone call this morning with Secretary Sutters in Massachusetts, and they don't anticipate getting through the 75-year-olds who are the current people up to bat until probably the end of February. The next group is 65 plus year olds and people with 2 comorbidities. So we're probably looking at sometime in early March before workers at biotech manufacturers would be eligible. And I think that, as you mentioned on education, it's so important, I believe, for the employers to really provide clear guidance to the employees on kind of what is the state of affairs, when might we be eligible, what kind of proof of eligibility will we need, will there be a help desk or some kind of telephone support to help us through, because the news stories about how difficult it is to get through the labyrinth of appointment making in Massachusetts anyway is really an obstacle and a source of great frustration and a drain on productivity. So I think for right now, we're very much mindful of, how can we prepare our employees for when voluntary vaccination is available. And then in parallel, we're considering whether it would be in the company's interest and consistent with its culture and the right thing to do to mandate. As you've outlined, there are some, big complicating factors, but, I think it's sort of a challenge accepted mentality. I don't know of many companies who have announced to their employees or to the community yet in the biotech space that they are going to mandate. I was on a call a while ago with maybe about 75 GCs, and 8% said they were either likely to or had made that decision. Some were considering it, and many were saying, we're so far from that. One other thing I just wanted to mention before turning it over to Darren is in Massachusetts, we now have an avenue for applying to become a site for vaccination for our employees or for a cluster of biotech employees. You have to have a group of 200 or more, and it really seems to require contracting with a clinical provider. And then we would get into the framework that was described so well by the Hogan team. And I think it's great that you've pointed out the intersection of a mandate and that vaccine clinic, because we believe our employees would be so grateful if there was a mobile unit or a part of we have some big lobbies, some big spaces that was just there for vaccination, and over time, even for family members. My spouse used to work at Novartis, and through Sandoz, of course, they had an annual flu program like many people do, but they provided free vaccines to all employees and all their family members. And it was just an annual thing, and you'd make your appointment, and it was I think it was maybe 3 different weekends, Saturday and Sunday. It would be, if we're going to be in a mode where we need some kind of annual or periodic vaccination, or we need a boost after this first one, a program like that could really, really be helpful. And then just on maybe just a note of some humor, I guess. The training of our staffs as we think about helping people through this, especially if one were to mandate, is so key. Like understanding how broad disability is. I mean, you know, as scientifically oriented companies and caring for patients, we would never want an employee, for example, who had a severe allergy condition or a bleeding disorder, or was pregnant or was hoping to become pregnant, to, you know, somehow misinterpret a mandate to mean that they should do something against the advice of their HCP or put themselves in harm's way. So we've really got to be thoughtful about that, I think. And then also on the religious front, as George mentioned, it doesn't have to be theistic, and there's a federal court ruling, and maybe more than one, that veganism qualifies. That if you're vegan and that's what you practice, then you would merit accommodation. That case involved a hospital worker who declined to submit to a mandatory flu vaccine. So, you know, uncharted waters for some of us, and we got to be careful. But very, very exciting that J&J may come forward with huge supply. I mean, their manufacturing looks really enormous. Their vaccine in the United States apparently was something like 72% effective, and it seems to have effectiveness against the new variants. So, you know, I think the media getting all hung up on 92 or 95 versus, you know, the 72 is a bit of a pity, because it might really make people think about, well, I want to get in line for the Moderna vaccine, or I want the Pfizer one. And certainly in Massachusetts, you cannot choose right now. When you get your appointment at Fenway or Gillette or wherever you're going, they give you what they give you.
Yeah, I think that's such an interesting perspective, Lori, and you're right. You know, part of the complicating factor is you read every day in the Wall Street Journal or in the New York Times, whatever your paper of choice is, or I suppose Twitter or Facebook, unfortunately. And you are hit over the head with here's who's getting vaccines, here's who's not. And I think what a lot of people don't understand is just how different every state is treating their prioritization of vaccinations. You know, there was sort of, you know, comically over the weekend, Saturday Night Live did a spoof, and they featured, you know, someone playing O.J. Simpson who had been vaccinated apparently very publicly in California, and you know, they juxtaposed that with the 70-year-old grandmother with 3 comorbidities that couldn't get vaccinated in California. And yeah, so there's a lot of news pervading this, and I think education is going to be very important, and also getting people understanding where they do fall in line. You know, as you said, in Massachusetts, the question is very different relative to what it might be, what Darren can talk to us maybe about for a second in California, you know, and then you look at my home state of Virginia, where somehow we lawyers qualify to be in phase 1C. So, you know, how that decision got made, I don't know, but when my name comes up, I suppose I'll sign up. You know, so I think it's a really confusing category for a lot of people to understand where they are in line. And you know, to that point, Darren, you're all the way across the country in California, and famously, that state is in the news every day for a variety of COVID-related reasons, which you don't need to opine on. But it would be interesting to hear from you, sort of your perspective.
Yeah, so thanks, John. And I will, it was a good segue into what I'll talk about as far as the confusion out there about the tiers, especially in California. But before I do that, I also want to you know, echo Lori's comments to the Hogan team. You guys did a great job. That was very helpful, very informative. I really appreciated the way it was framed up as more as a practical exercise, because sometimes that's what it really boils down to. So thank you guys very much, and thank you, John, for inviting and Nurikrin and myself to be on the program today on the webinar. Lori is always a tough follow. She covered a wide variety of topics, and so I'm going to try not to duplicate hers. But I will say that in California, the challenge is twofold. I think one is education of what the standards are, and making sure that people understand and our employees understand where they are in the tiers, which has been an issue because even the officials don't understand the tiers that they put out. And then secondfold is the fact that our tiers change virtually every day. So, you know, we've got theoretically 3 tiers, 1, 2, and 3, but then within tier 1, there's tier 1A, 1B, and 1C. And then within tier A, there's phase 1A, tier 1, phase 1A, tier 2, and phase 1A, tier 3. And so first responders, folks working on the front line clearly were in the very first tiers. But then there was a brief while where anyone who worked in a lab was eligible to get the vaccine. And that was the state of California's tiering strategy. But then each county was interpreting it different. And I know there were counties in the Bay Area that said anyone who works in a biotech lab is eligible. And then in San Diego County, where we're based, when about half of our employees across the country, half of them are here in San Diego and the other half are dispersed around the country. In San Diego, they said biotech lab workers were not eligible, and so they were at odds with the state. And so there we had some of our lab workers who were able to get vaccinated, and some were turned away. It kind of depended upon which site you went to and what lane you were in. And then they took away the lab workers for a while altogether. But then they put in, for a brief period of time in San Diego, it was anyone who works in a life science company is eligible. And so a number of our employees tried to get vaccinated, and most were successful. But then they took that away after about 48 hours. And so what's frustrating for us, folks on the ground trying to advise our groups of employees who are eager to get vaccinated, as most of us are, is that there seems to be no logic to their categorizations. There are groups of people in there that maybe just have a better lobbyist, perhaps, than the life sciences community, but it's not based upon sort of service to the community or people who are in a profession where they might be at greater exposure to either getting the virus or sharing it with other people. And so, trying to discern the nuances in their tiers has been a challenge because it's virtually impossible to follow the logic behind it. And so, we've had a number of employees who have done what I think is being called vax hunting. And so they've gone down to sites and hung out at the end of the day. And if they have extra vaccine, then they've been able to get it. But there's been no rhyme or reason to that either. Theoretically, there's only about 10 sites in San Diego County that are supposed to be vaccinating sites. But we hear stories of doctors' offices having access to the vaccine, and at the end of the day, just distribute it to whoever happens to be walking into their office. And so it's been real frustrating for our employees and for us as leaders to try to educate them, to your point earlier, John, of what the standards are and why they're eligible, why they're not eligible. What we are, just thinking how, to, I think it was Lori's point a month ago, or John's point a month ago, we didn't think we'd be in this position of having to talk about, or think about what to do with the vaccine going forward. And we're really fortunate, it's been a crazy year, as we all know. A year ago at this time, we were still calling it SARS-CoV-2 and really unsure what it was going to do and how it was going to play out. And now, only a year later, it has played out worse than anybody anticipated, I think. And also, we're looking at a vaccine which nobody would have predicted a year ago. So it is a great time for the biotech community, I think, because it really has given us an opportunity as a community to demonstrate our worth on a large public scale in a public health way that had been, quite frankly, questioned up until this last year about the value biotech communities and pharma companies bring to public health. Has been a challenging time for us in the PR space. But now we have these vaccines, and so what we're thinking about as far as our company goes right now is that we don't have to make a decision on whether to make it mandatory. We certainly don't have any availability. We're not sure if we're going to have availability. But we think that our employee population is fairly educated about this and fairly smart about this, And we're going to encourage people to get vaccinated, and we think everyone will, except for those people who have an objection, for a valid reason, probably won't. But, we would love to be able to do like we do every year for the flu vaccine and just have a nurse come in, some nurses come in and everybody line up and get the vaccine if they can. But we haven't made a decision on making it mandatory. We do think that we're going to have some of our clinical trial sites that may make it mandatory for folks to come in, and then we will cross that bridge with our employees who need to visit those sites at that time. And then we think that we're going to have some manufacturers that we will that we go and audit and visit with, and who may make it mandatory at that time. But we haven't, unfortunately, it's not widespread use enough of the vaccine for those third parties to institute those types of policies. But we think when they will, if we have employees who are unwilling to get vaccinated, we will probably just shift their job responsibilities. But we're fairly confident that most of our employees will get vaccinated. We do mandatory testing of all employees every week for COVID, and there's some, I think, valid debate in the legal community about whether or not you can do mandatory testing. But fortunately, our employees have embraced it. They've wanted to get tested. We found most of the people who've tested positive were asymptomatic. And so it's been a blessing for them that they've found out that they were testing positive and they could go into quarantine and they didn't spread it. Because we do the voluntary, or we do the testing every week, we have allowed employees who want to come into the office and work, they can. The standards in California on whether you should work from home or not are, shall we say, fluid at times. But we allow the employees to come in who want to come in, who, if they can't work from home for whatever reason, they can come in. And we've got a couple hundred employees who come in on a periodic basis. And based on our testing data so far, I think it's not a stretch to say the safest place to be in San Diego is within Neurocrine's four walls, because we have had no community transmission at all. And so we're very fortunate that way, because our employees are largely compliant with social distancing and masking and washing hands and staying at home if you have any symptoms. So we've been fortunate not to have any cases that have been community transmission within the building. And we think that once we get the vaccine available on a more broad basis, most of our employees, if not all, are going to take the vaccine, and so we won't have to call up George or David or Melissa and ask for any advice on what to do for those employees that are unwilling to get the vaccine. So.
Well, thanks, Darren, and thanks to all our panelists. I think this is obviously a really evolving situation, and judging by the fact that we had in excess of 220 participants on this, it's obviously a hot topic amongst the biotech workforce, and we appreciate everybody's time here today. Hopefully we can do another webinar in like 6 months where we talk about how good the re-entry into the workforce went for us, or perhaps more interestingly, a retrospective discussion of how COVID changed our view on how often everyone needs to be in the physical workplace moving forward, because I know that is a dynamic that is changing. I had a colleague of mine say the other day that while we will never look back on the year 2020 fondly, we may look back on the year 2020 as the year that pulled forward what would have been 10 years in changes to the way we look at working and digital technology and their interplay into a 9-month span. And I think that's probably right. So, we I think as an industry have a lot to be proud of over the past 12 months, and I think we have more to be proud of as this situation continues to be evolving, and hopefully we all on this webinar are doing our best to educate as we can the broader community about the value of these vaccines, and hopefully perhaps that translates into a broader discussion about the value of all vaccines. Given the emerging hesitancy that has come up over the past several years as it relates to some of the more longstanding vaccines that have really, been the stamp out of other pandemics from past. So, I think this has been a great conversation. As I said, for purposes of this, let's see if we have any questions here. Trying to see if I can find them.
Hey, John, while you're pulling up the questions, I really wanted to pick up on something Darren said, which was the fluid situation and how rapidly interpretation or even just new provisions appear. And for the benefit of anyone in Massachusetts on the phone, in our state where we're really looking to this supply chain worker provision, it's clear that if you manufacture or oversee the manufacture of a biopharma product or maybe a device or a diagnostic, then you've got a hook to hang the coat on. Unfortunately, right now, the preclinical biotech companies in Massachusetts are really not finding, any part of phase 2 that, unless they're vaccine developers, if they're developing a vaccine, it looks like maybe even, the whole company that's doing vaccine development or tied to the vaccine development would be eligible. And, it's just TBD on whether the state will clarify that. And another thing that just came up today is, and this is true in the New Jersey area too, where you can have employees who work full time in one state but live in another state. And in that instance, would a person who lives in Rhode Island or New Hampshire be eligible to obtain a vaccine in Massachusetts because they work in Massachusetts? Kind of an, we think maybe, but unclear that in that respect too. So depending on where people on the phone have their workers, that could be something to monitor as well.
Yeah, that's a good point, Lori. And I do want to pick up, there are a couple of questions we had submitted that we'll try and do while we have a little bit of time remaining here. So slide decks. So I think this one is for George. So vaccinations provided on site with company employed nurses. Is there a difference in liability and vaccination by company workers versus contract workers? Maybe George knows that too. Or sorry, maybe David has that too.
Yeah, I think David, you might want to speak to PrEP Act. I have some general considerations, but they may be superseded by PrEP Act.
From the PrEP Act perspective, it shouldn't matter whether they're employees or contractors. If they'll be covered persons. If they're qualified persons, which would include those that are licensed by the state to administer vaccines, and perhaps some others. If you have a specific question for someone that's actually not licensed by the state, it may be possible, and we can address that offline.
Great.
Yeah, and I guess from my perspective, if the PrEP Act does not protect, the issue would be, if we're talking about an employee who makes a mistake, that's going to be more clear liability directly to the employer. If it's a contractor, maybe you've got indemnification rights that you've negotiated with the person or entity that's providing the vaccination. So there could be a better way to protect yourself if it's not your own employees.
Yeah, but if you're running the clinic, the company is a program planner, not just the individual people. So there's liability protection for the company if the company qualifies as a program planner in organizing a vaccination clinic.
Great. One other question that is sort of an interesting one, and George, you may have an answer for this, and the question relates to prospective employees as we're scaling up workforce. Are there guidelines around whether we can ask about the vaccination status of potential employees, and or whether or not we can mandate folks be vaccinated prior to their being hired?
That's a great question. So this is an area where the EOC has not weighed in, but let me give you some guideposts and some thoughts about that. So the typical rule when you're thinking about what questions can we ask people during the interview process, the application process, you want to just be careful that the questions that you're asking aren't going to give an appearance that you're making an employment decision on that basis if you don't mean to. So I think that if you have a mandatory program, I think if you could, I think logically ask, have you been vaccinated? We have a mandatory vaccination program, and if not, are you willing to get vaccinated? But you have to be prepared for potential religious accommodation or disability accommodation issues that come up, and you would have to go through that same analysis that you would for employees. You don't get to sort of skip that because they are applicants. If we're talking about a voluntary program, I think my advice on that would be to wait until after the interview process to make the decision to, not just the interview process, but after the conditional offer of employment is made, to ask those questions. Because if you ask it during the interview process and they say no, there may be, they may think, hey, the reason I didn't get hired is because of, that I wasn't willing to get vaccinated. And then the question is that really a voluntary program or not? So that would be my sense. There can be more details there. Happy to talk more about a specific scenario or help plan if you want.
Great. And then one more question here. Any specific suggestions on the types of incentives you could offer to get a vaccination?
Yeah, so what I've seen, and actually I took a quick peek at my email, and stay tuned, because I try to do this because I have a bad luck with the law changing when I'm giving webinars. And there was a little bit of a development here, but first let me talk about the current state of things, and then I'll talk about what I just saw hit my inbox. So I think that the safest kind of thing when we're talking about incentives are, you give people time off that's really tied to the inconvenience associated with the vaccine. If you do it that way, it helps protect you, because in theory, if you offer an incentive for someone to do something and people can't get it on the basis of disability or religion, they could request an exemption to get the incentive without getting the vaccine, which would be sort of a difficult situation for employers to deal with. So if you said $10,000 checks for everybody that gets vaccinated, right? That's a great incentive. That's wonderful. But you may have people that come to you and say, hey, I want an accommodation that enables me to get that. And you'd have to go through the analysis to think about that. So that's one of the reasons that I think keeping the incentives to be on the smaller side, to be really kind of focused on the time it would take to go get the vaccine, and potentially some additional time if you need to take a day off to if you have side effects. I think that is probably a safer way to go. Now, the update I have is that there are a number of business groups that, and this just was reported today, that sent the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission a letter asking for vaccine incentive guidance, saying that, look, we're not exactly sure what the rules are. There are some rules around, the EEOC has wellness plan requirements, and the state of those is very much up in the air. There were some wellness plan regulations. They're struck down in part. There's a new set of rules that's been proposed by the EEOC during the Trump administration, and now it's sort of unclear what the standard is going to be. There's a lot of nuance there. But the bottom line is that hopefully we'll get some guidance from the EEOC, because I think the issue of incentives is one where, employers, I think a lot of employers would like to have some clear guidance on that issue. And, you shouldn't be in a situation where, no good deed goes unpunished. You're like trying to do something nice for your employees, and you end up getting into a battle with somebody over disability or religion. So anyway, I guess stay tuned on that. But in the meantime, incentives that are, relatively modest and really tied to the inconvenience, I think are the way to go.
George, speaking of relatively modest incentives, I heard a news report I thought was interesting. The Russians were giving out ice cream as an incentive, and I thought, well, that would be all I'd need. I wouldn't need 4 hours off work if you gave me a scoop of ice cream.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. You have your vaccine clinic at work with some ice cream afterward while you're waiting for your 15 minutes after the vaccine.
It reminds us of getting a lollipop at the pediatrician, right? Yeah, I really, one employer in Texas indicated in a media interview that they were offering $500 as an incentive, which is pretty significant. As you said earlier, George, I think it was you, George, in terms of state law and in the wage and labor space, I think really looking at how you would deal with the people who have legitimate needs for accommodations. One company said that if they could get to 90% vaccinated, then all employees would get the incentive, because that's really what they were looking for, is for, the herd, a very meaningful level of herd immunity. So that's kind of creative, and we love creativity in the life sciences.
Yeah, I've seen that idea, a sort of group, a group bonus, and I think that that something like that does avoid some of these accommodation questions in a way. Now, there could be complications if people find out who hasn't been vaccinated and start getting, hey, let's pressure this person to get vaccinated. You could get into some situations there, but hopefully, that's not going to be the case. Hopefully, there's not that issue going on. But it is an interesting concept.
Well, Darren mentioned that they're mandating testing at their company, which is just great. It's really giving people a feeling of safety. We have voluntary testing, frequently, maybe more than 80% people participating. One biotech company I talked to this morning, they have 85 employees. They did a little pulse survey of how many of you want to be vaccinated as soon as it's available to you, and 84 of 85 employees said, yes, I'm in. So, I think that we probably do tend to have a population that's quite different from the general public.
Yeah, and I think it's important too, and I think we've seen this in the past in some of the places I've worked, is getting that education out sometimes is really important too, because so many of us have worked in this professional space for so long, but often as our companies get larger, you have other employees who really don't have a lot of life science perspective because they've worked in maybe non-life science finance or non-life science HR. And I think it's still, like I see it around Bio's Flu Clinic a lot, we still do a lot of advertising about the value of it. And I think that's the kind of thing to help spur people, because maybe not everybody's going to offer an incentive. I would love if Bio wants to give me $10,000 to get a vaccine that I'm already going to get as soon as I can. But I don't think that's reasonable. And in addition to all of the the complications, George, you've highlighted. But I think the more education, probably the better, because this is obviously a really important one, and I really hope that Dr. Gottlieb is wrong in this case, where he sort of predicted that demand would drop off pretty heavily at about 120 million vaccinations. I hope that's not the case, although we can't get kids vaccinated yet, so there's still going to be a material portion of the population for a while. Well, I really appreciate everybody's time here today, and this was really productive and I think really helpful for the folks. And just to reiterate, because I know that question came up in the chat again, we will work with our marketing team to make sure we can get the slides around to folks that also include the team's contact information. And then we will also have a recording of this webinar available, and we can send out instructions for how to access that once we talk with the IT team and we get a sense of how to do that. So thanks everybody for your time, and I will sign off for the team and let everybody take a break for the afternoon, maybe.
Thanks, John.
Thanks so much, John.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.